Joining me now to preview the Knicks game against the Washington Wizards. Since the Knicks just played the Wizards on Friday, we figured we'd go a little outside the box with our discussion. And instead of getting somebody that covers the team, we'll get somebody that covered one of their best players in a most recent article for NBA.com. He is someone who covers the NBA at large for NBA.com. And he, again, just had a Q&A with the one and only Kristaps Porzingis. Mr. Mark Medina, welcome to the Knicks Film School Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Excited.
I'm excited to have you. And, it's funny. He's 2 trades removed from being a Knick. And yet there will always still be a connection with Kristaps Porzingis. Even if he leaves the Wizards to go to another team, he will not be former Wizard. He will not be former Maverick. He will always be former Knick, Kristaps Porzingis, first and foremost, it feels. Loved the Q&A, loved the questions that you threw at him. If we can just go back to the beginning of the article, what was the idea going into the story, and what did you want to accomplish with this Q&A?
Yeah, it's a good question. Basically, I wanted to accomplish a mix of catching up with his time in Washington and how that fit is, what the latest is on his health, because as Knicks fans often know, that's always been a tenuous thing, but as well as also see if we can revisit his time in New York and Dallas and the ups and downs and what went wrong and how he looks back at it. So I think, from an author, I'm very glad that KP was willing to give his time and candor. Of course, like with any writer, you always wish there's even more, candor, even more illumination. So while, I think Kristaps Porzingis deserves a lot of kudos for, being open and, answering what could have been some tough questions. Obviously, he wanted to keep things respectful, so there were times that he didn't go into too much detail. But as it pertains to the Knicks, I think that he was remarkably candid with a few things. One, that he does miss New York. He misses playing at MSG, and he does have that what-if feeling, that what if he were healthy, how things would play out. And in his mind, it would be much more successful. But I think he was also candid with taking ownership, that while I think that he did feel justified of having misgivings with how the organization was run, that he also put some blame on himself as far as how he handled those things. Now, he didn't go chapter and verse about, hey, I should have done this better, I should have done that better. But I think when you connect the dots, it was very clear that there was some hint of regret that, from his end, he could have been much more communicative and more professional with the front office, but he also made it clear, look, no one was perfect on either side. So I think as it pertains to this big picture, there is this ultimate what if of what if he stayed healthy? What if the Knicks, front office wasn't dysfunctional as it was then? And how would it have played out if those two variables weren't such serious issues?
I'd be lying if in my entire life as a Knicks fan, if I wasn't also asking, what if the Knicks weren't dysfunctional? Would things be different in that sense? Although I think I'm much happier with the way things are right now. And I mean, you kind of knocked off some answers already to some of my questions, but just to clarify, did this seem like a person, because he's got the opt-out this offseason, this seemed like a person that was reflecting now as a 27-year-old on some mistakes that happened in the past that he has closure on, or just with somebody that does have impending free agency that misses New York, kind of creating an idea that there's no hard feelings, wouldn't hate the idea of coming back to the Garden one day, not as a visitor?
Well, look, as you know, you never know in the NBA. Things change very quickly. It's a relationship business. I think from a literal standpoint, I did ask KP about what's he going to do with the player option. He said that was too early of a discussion. Even he was mindful at the time, hey, Kyle Kuzma's made it public. He's going to opt out of his his contract so he can be a free agent. But he, really just want to see how the season plays out. Obviously, he doesn't have any pressure to make a decision now. I think on one hand, as much as the Wizards have been losing, most notably because of Bradley Beal's injuries, he was making it very clear that he feels very comfortable in this environment, primarily because of how he's been used as being able to have the ball in his hands a lot more than earlier, both at his time in New York and in Dallas. He is posting career high numbers. So I think from a production role standpoint, he is content with that with Washington. But the reality is this. Business talks as well as wins and losses. And obviously the Wizards have been struggling. Now, does that mean that he would be open to going back to New York? I think there's a lot of things that would have to come into place for that. But I think if nothing else, I think the context of this conversation was more of looking back, trying to be candid. And also, I think being honest about how he felt, where on one hand, he does miss kind of that environment of playing at MSG at the time. That's all he knew. And I think it was an eye-opener later on in his career that, it's very unique to play for the Knicks and the market that it brings. So I wouldn't say from his standpoint, the door's ever shut. And I think that he also made it clear that he was given that platform to criticize how things were handled. And I think that he wanted to keep it open-ended for a reason and vague and respectful. I think, if nothing else, at least to show that he's, I think taking the higher platform of not trashing an organization. So whether that greases the wheels for a reunion down the line, you never rule that out in today's NBA. But I think that the main driving force was just career reflection and trying to take ownership, as well as be very clear that, this wasn't taken out of turn. There was a reason why he felt the way he felt during his time of the ups and downs in New York.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me, aside from obviously the Knicks headline of him redressing what had happened back then, was the notable maturity that I sensed from his answers. And I remember when I was 22 and then when I was 27 and the different person that I was, and, how much growing up can be done during that time. And obviously I didn't have billion-dollar organizations on a public scale trading me, in the middle of that, as a result. Look, aside from the Knicks have no cap space reason, and
right.
Also from the sense of, you mentioned how he's being used, and he addresses the differences between not even just the Knicks, but specifically like Dallas and how he's being used in Washington. And I wonder, like with the Knicks and fit, like I'm sure they would figure it out if they were to make a commitment. Like I would imagine a Julius Randle is no longer here in this sense because usage is a thing. But I was curious throughout the reading your Q&A, would the basketball fit even make sense, especially when you bring up what happened in Dallas and how much he seemingly didn't enjoy that. Is that like the bigger takeaway you had as far as Dallas is concerned when he was discussing Luka? Like he mentioned, like it just wasn't a good fit, but he doesn't sound like he has hard feelings with what happened there.
Yeah, I think the complicated thing with New York and Dallas is the injuries obviously put a wrench in everything. And, it's the old adage, the best ability is availability. And, KP will be the first to admit it. He didn't hold up that end of the bargain. Now, with injuries to some element, there's, some uncontrollable aspects with that. But what I found interesting about his time with Dallas is that when I talked with him last year, when he was with the Dallas Mavericks, and there was hope that he was turning a corner with a health standpoint and that he would be utilized a lot more to his comfort level under Jason Kidd than it was with Rick Carlisle, he was saying that he and Luka Doncic had the potential to be one of the best duos in the league. And fast forward a year later, and he's saying, looking back, I think long-term it wasn't going to be a fit. Now, similar to the Knicks, I tried pressing, hey, why don't you think it was going to be a fit? And he wanted to keep it respectful and he didn't go into detail. But I think if you connect the dots with this Q&A, I then followed up later on, hey, well, Clippers coach Ty Lue, the Clippers were playing the Wizards at the time when I conducted the interview. He observed from afar that, hey, you seem a lot more comfortable because you have the ball in your hands. Like, what does that do for your game? And he started going very in deep about how he feels that once he has the ball in his hands, a lot of things happens where he can be a scoring threat. He can be a facilitator that can really ensure the ball movement. So I think the two elements are tied together. That Luka Doncic, he has the ball in his hands a lot. And there has been this push-pull that the Mavericks have been even experiencing since KP's departure in lieu of Jalen Brunson going to the Knicks. And even when Jalen Brunson was with the Mavs, of how much, where do we draw the line in the sand of relying on Luka's brilliance because he's going to win us ball games and there's not a lot of options versus the long-term picture of, hey, we got to elevate some sort of supporting cast around him so we're not wearing Luka out, even at a young 20-year-old or, in his young 20s. And so I think with that, there is certainly an understanding that Luka is justified in having the ball in his hands a lot. But the reality is, for KP to be at his best, that just isn't a long-term solution. I think that there could have been a happy medium. And I think that was what the Mavericks had hoped for. But the reality is the injuries ultimately derailed that, as well as some of his inconsistency of how he would adjust his role as either a primary facilitator, a primary pick and pop player, as opposed to a post player. In an ideal circumstance, he wants to be able to blend all those things together, not just be boxed into one skill set.
Yeah, I think you find this a lot. I'm sure you've heard this across your time covering the NBA, and obviously in the past covering the Warriors, just how much ball movement can lead to nobody getting bored on offense and everybody getting to touch the ball. We've had some debates amongst our Knicks circle about the Knicks offense and how little ball movement there can be, how much ISO there can be, and even if it may succeed toward a positive offensive rating or a net rating in general, you also may have some guys that aren't being utilized as best as they could because they're not in rhythm. It's like you get your 5 shots a game, they have to be perfect. And, to a larger extent with KP, he might just need the ball more to be utilized a little better. Do you think anybody would be frustrated with injuries, but because of like his scouting report at the combine and, obviously being with his size, like, the stigma of like we'll have injury issues in the future. Do you think he's frustrated by like he's always going to have to deal with the fact that the injury concern is going to be like a stigma on him and a reputation that he's going to have to overcome?
I don't necessarily think he's frustrated with any stigma. I think, throughout this entire interview, but particularly with the health questions, like there wasn't any hint of defensiveness or, why are you going down this rabbit hole of getting into the injury history? I mean, he was more than willing to entertain those questions, but no doubt he's been very frustrated with just the injuries themselves and how that's kept him unavailable. It certainly had created those what ifs of how things could have played out in New York and Dallas. And there's a lot of things that he's done to try to address those things. This past summer, he lost 7 pounds as the reason was he just wanted to put less pressure on his joints. He's doing a lot of different lunges and squatting, making sure that, just his kinetic chain, that's a medical term that trainers use as far as like your body composition, that there's more balance. There's a lot more collaboration with the Wizards medical staff of, being proactive with injuries. But I know Wes Unsfeld Jr. mentioned that there's been a healthy balance of him playing through bumps and bruises, but also him buying into the staff of being very proactive and being cautious. But with that, during all these challenges, he made it a point to really tap into different like mindfulness exercises to make sure that he was taking care of his mental health, because that was a huge challenge that he went through while dealing with the physical toll of injuries. And so that's one thing that I wouldn't say it's a silver lining. Like ideally he would have been healthy his entire career, but because of these bad set of circumstances, these last few off seasons, and in particular this past off season, he really tapped into the mindfulness exercises, whether it's meditation and yoga. So he's in this positive frame of mind. And then the other thing is when he was going through these long-term absences, it really made him reflect, like, what does he identify himself as a person? Like, what's he all about? And so while he still feels like he has a lot of basketball left, this really triggered the importance for him to feel, that he's valued and has some sort of self-worth outside of basketball. So with that, he does a lot of hobbies, mixed martial arts training. He said that it didn't have anything to do with like basketball regimen, so I left it out of the Q&A. But I thought it was an interesting tidbit that he's made a point to try to have a good work-life balance so that, heaven forbid, he gets hurt, he doesn't spiral into this deep depression because he doesn't have basketball. But I think with this interview, reflecting on a lot of challenging parts of his career, he was remarkably candid and friendly and approachable. And while I think that he did hold back on certain things from his time in Dallas and New York, it really came from a wanting to be seen as being respectful from these parties as opposed to being defensive with the line of questioning.
That makes me happy that he's figured out a work-life balance, again, admitting that his tenure here had the highest of highs while some dysfunction was going on. Another takeaway you can easily get from the Q&A was just how much the ACL injury began a domino effect of setbacks. He's not New York. At least I don't think he's in New York because of the injury. At least it was the beginning of steps down that road. And, I was talking to Ava Wallace of the Washington Post last week to preview the Wizards game. And it was brought to my attention how much he disliked the time zone he was living in, how the Mavericks home games were much more difficult to watch for his family back home. And so it like you said, it sounded like someone who's done a little bit of growing up, done a little bit of self-reflection, and is just in a better place than he was a few years ago. Is that a fair assessment overall?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think the injuries, they compounded other, I think, long-term challenges that he admittedly encountered in New York. His dynamic with the front office, to this day, he still has a lot of reverence for Phil Jackson because he's the one who drafted him. But obviously, there's differing views of how he looks at, ownership and the rest of the front office. And then, back to what we're saying, what I was talking about, his candor about the long-term fit with Luka Doncic. But I think the reality is when you're not healthy, you don't have a way to kind of sort these things out on the fly. A lot of the solutions to potential long-term problems can be, hey, getting games on the floor and kind of figuring things out and seeing how some trial and error ultimately works out. And frankly, because he hadn't been able to stay healthy, he wasn't able to address those things on the court. So I think objectively, outside looking in, if he were healthy, some of these things probably would have still persisted. But I think that you could have made the argument that maybe he could have solved one or either of those things, frankly, because he would have had more game reps to solve it. And I think when you're looking at Dallas versus New York, seems more realistic would have been able to solve it in Dallas because of just figuring out that long-term fit with Luka, where with New York, it's more of things off the court with dealing with the front office dynamics and their direction with the organization, their communication style. But it is that ultimate what if that he'll be the first to admit. He does wonder how it would play out if he hadn't been hurt in both stints.
Was there anything, this would be my last question, by the way, is there anything that he refused to answer or something you didn't get to ask him that you wish you would have? I know he kind of dismissed the exit meeting question. At least that's how it came off in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, he didn't refuse to answer any questions. But, there were things as shown in the Q&A where he'll say, hey, I don't want to get too much into detail here. But again, I was allowed to ask whatever I wanted. And, to his defense, he's allowed to answer or not answer anything he wanted. But I think that was revealing. And, while the Q&A, it's basically a verbatim transcript, just a little peek behind the curtain. It is edited to the degree of taking out any long-windedness answers or things like that. But I think, when you mentioned the exit meeting, and his words there, I think when you connect the dots about, hey, I was being advised to do certain things this way and that way, I think he was very much trying to give the message that this wasn't necessarily his idea of missing the exit meeting. But then the follow-up question that I had, and the only reason why it was taken out is I wound up using his answers in the lead of the story. I followed up asking, well, how much did that just have to do with just the turbulence going on with the organization? Even if you don't want to point blame at anyone. He's like, oh yeah, no doubt. And then that's when he segued into saying, hey, no one was perfect. No one was perfect. That was the lead quote that I had in my story. And then he started pivoting in toward his gratitude about Phil Jackson. So clearly, he was saying it wasn't perfect on either side. There is a connection to that exit meeting, the reasons behind it. But big picture, he did want to give that message that while I had my reasons for acting the way I did. I don't want to like further inflame the situation, and big picture, I want to show that I'm giving respect to the organization and also taking ownership to a degree of some of my own shortcomings at the time.
Yeah, as someone who remembers that summer extremely well, because it was like one of the first that I'd started doing this type of extensive content and covering the team. And yeah, the exit meeting became a story because that season just was very turbulence filled with Phil and Melo, and then obviously the exit meeting. It did. I got the takeaway that he was saying I got some bad advice, and then it led to like the rest of the story where you referenced, there's blame to go around, but the front office, like everybody involved, could have done things better. And look, I'll be curious to see what happens with his impending free agency, as well as just like with his career, and that's not even necessarily Knicks related. I think I personally have closure with the way things went down. And, it's good to hear that it seems like he does as well. Mark, you've been outstanding. You've been great with your time. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you have multiple things that you cover, both on the West Coast, but I guess at the NBA at large. If you'd like to plug anything to our listeners, please do so.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's been a real joy and pleasure. You already plugged the Kristaps Porzingis Q&A, but, my role with NBA.com, I'm based in LA, so I don't necessarily cover the LA teams, but I go to a lot of Laker Clipper games to write about them, as well as write about the teams coming in, and that gives an avenue to catch up with someone like Kristaps Porzingis when the Washington Wizards were in town. But as far as plugging the stuff, I'm on NBA.com, do some TV work with NBA TV at Spectrum Sportsnet based in LA, as well as some radio work with Fox Sports Radio. And you got the Twitter handle there, Mark G_Medina. So you can follow my work on all those different channels.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, so much.
Hey, thanks so much. Have fun. It should be an interesting Knicks season, as it always is, for better or for worse.
It's at least been watchable, which we haven't been able to guarantee in the past. And it's even enjoyed some winning at the same time. So it should be, hopefully it stays that way. Thanks again, Mark.
Hey, thanks so much.